Oh, you look so happy. This guy who's interviewing you.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. To everybody who's joined, we want to begin by extending our gratitude to each of you in light of what we've all been facing the past year, for showing up for yourself, for showing up for your kids, for your neighbors, for your family, for your community, and for the city, for your resilience and courage. We say thank you. And thank you for your ongoing support and loyalty to Robin Hood. I'm Jabali Sawicki. I'll be your moderator for tonight's session. I'm a Robin Hood Leadership Council member and currently serve as the Compass Director of NXU, a youth purpose incubator whose mission is to catalyze a diverse community of youth to explore, articulate, and pursue their purpose. This discussion marks Robin Hood's first plugged-in event of 2021. Plugged In is a virtual transformation of Robin Hood's signature Unplugged speaker series that invites the Robin Hood community to learn and engage with the evolving issues of our city and our nation. We know how busy all of you are and how zoomed out you probably are, so thank you for joining us. Tonight, I'm honored to be in conversation with Dr. Harold Koplewicz, the President and Medical Director of Child Mind Institute. Among other things, we're here to discuss his work and his new book, The Scaffold Effect, Raising Resilient, Self-Reliant, and Secure Kids in an Age of Anxiety, which introduces a new parenting philosophy and strategies on how to raise resilient, self-reliant, and secure children. Dr. Koplewitz's insights could not be more timely as we all continue to navigate an unprecedented pandemic that has severely uprooted the lives of our children and our lives as parents, and introduced a slew of new stressors and challenges. We got a lot to cover tonight. Couple of quick housekeeping items. In our Zoom webinar format, all of you wonderful participants will remain technically muted, but not spiritually muted. We've collected audience questions in advance of this conversation, and you can use the Q&A chat box to ask questions directly throughout. We set aside about 15 minutes on the back end for Q&A. Thank you all for being here. Let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Koplewicz, I'll now call you Harold for the rest of the session. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Now, I know the Child Mind Institute has been a longtime partner of Robin Hood. To start us off, talk to us about the work that you and your team do.
So the Child Mind Institute is the only national independent nonprofit that's exclusively dedicated to transforming the lives of children and their families who struggle with a mental health or learning disorder. And to help everyone understand how big a problem this is, it's 1 out of 5 kids in the United States today have a mental health disorder. That means 17 million kids under the age of 18 have or have had a mental health disorder, compared to 7 million with diabetes, or 7 million with asthma, 7 million with peanut allergy, 200,000 with diabetes, and 15,000 with cancer. So if you take all the other diseases and roll them up, it's a little more than 14 million compared to how many kids have mental health disorders. And mental health disorders are barriers to learning. And without learning, that's the road to poverty or staying poor. So that we really often ignore the importance of mental health versus physical health. And if we continue to ignore it, there is inevitably people get stuck where they are. If they're too inattentive to pay attention, if they're too anxious to go to school, if they're too depressed and therefore too tired to get out of bed, those are the kids that we have to worry about. And COVID has just made this situation so much worse. And the way to think of COVID, it's a major stressor that affects everyone, but particularly children and teenagers who had a pre-existing anxiety disorder or depression before this major stressor came into our lives. So we're quite concerned at the Child Mind Institute, not only to provide gold standard care for kids, not only to provide free evaluations and brief treatment for kids who participate in our research protocols, but also to provide evidence-based knowledge for parents everywhere in English and in Spanish, particularly during COVID. So starting this past March, a year ago, we started doing Facebook Lives every day in Spanish and English for at least 4 months to help parents deal with distance learning, how to help their kids not feel isolated, how to give structure to their day. And we reached over 3 million people. And we've continued to provide these kind of services at childmind.org, as well as on our Facebook page, our Twitter page, and our Instagram. Things that, frankly, I didn't know about when I was not only in medical school, but in residency, that providing a way to get the word out is essential when it comes to mental health, since we're still wrapped in so much stigma and so many myths. So to help parents recognize it's real, common, and treatable, that's what part of our mission is at the Child Mind Institute.
Love it. And give us some context and some personal commentary. How did you come to do this work?
So, I'm one of the few people you'll meet who's in their 60s and would tell you that I would do it all over again in a New York minute. I love being a doctor, and I love being a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I actually went to medical school at Albert Einstein, which is in the Bronx, and thought I was going to be a pediatrician. That was what I love kids, and I would take care of kids. And after I matched in pediatrics at Jacobi Hospital, one of my professors, the chairman of radiation oncology, literally came over to me and said, "This is a terrible mistake. You shouldn't go into pediatrics. You need to go into a field that is a frontier, that you will never be, the answer is never there. You always have to keep looking for the answer. You'll be bored in pediatrics." And if you think about how incredibly presumptuous that was of a professor, it was like my parents were my professors, don't do this, do that. And this wonderful professor, by the way, named Charles Botstein, his son is Leon Botstein, who's the president of Bard College and the head of the American Philharmonic. Charles Botstein said to me, "I think you should be a radiation oncologist." I said, "I don't want to do that." "I think you should think about pediatric oncology. That's changing." I said, "It's too depressing." "Then maybe you should think about intervention cardiology." Mind you, we're in the 70s. No one knew what he was talking about. And he said, "Well, if you insist on working with children, then I think you should consider becoming a child psychiatrist." And at the time, it was all about play therapy and dream analysis. And I said, I don't think I want to do that. And he said, "Well, here at Einstein, it's still psychoanalytic, but at Columbia and at the National Institute of Mental Health, they're looking at CAT scans. This is way before MRIs. And we're looking at medication for children. And I promise you, if you take my advice, you will never be bored." And frankly, I listened to him. I did peds, and then I switched to general psychiatry, which you have to do before you become a child psychiatrist. And so I went to Cornell for general psychiatry, and then to Columbia for child psychiatry. And there was a professor there who was just as presumptuous as my parents and pushing as my parents, and said, "You shouldn't just go and practice. You should do a 2-year research fellowship. The field needs people who are thinking systematically." And so I spent 2 years literally looking at the efficacy of medication in treating children who have mental health disorders. And it really changed the way I thought. And after that, I very quickly, I skipped a lot of steps, and I became the chief of child and adolescent psychiatry at Long Island Jewish Medical Center, and recognized that the only way you can practice child psychiatry is in partnership with schools. And so I was very fortunate that the school districts in Queens and in Nassau County were desperate for people who were ready to evaluate kids when they needed it, not to put them on wait lists, how to collaborate with schools so that kids wouldn't need mental health professionals. And I did that for 10 years, and then went to NYU as the vice chairman of psychiatry, and very quickly was allowed to build the NYU Child Study Center. And then about 11 years ago, decided that we really needed a St. Jude's. We needed an independent nonprofit that was exclusively dedicated to one thing. And St. Jude's, for almost 60 years, has been laser focused on childhood cancer and has done a magnificent job. And I figured that if we could get rid of the stigma of childhood cancer, where people used to whisper the word cancer or use the, call it the big C, we need to do that for the more common problem of childhood mental illness or mental disorders. And so 11 years ago, started this independent nonprofit that very fortunately has been working almost from day one with Robin Hood. I started working with Robin Hood right after 9/11 when I was still at NYU. And their recognition that mental health is so essential for education and so essential for children's long-term, health, it's just as important as physical health, has made Robinhood a cherished partner for the Child Mind Institute.
Yeah, and listen, I like you, am a long-standing believer and appreciator of Robinhood's vision for education reform, for education equity. Just to give you a quick backstory, my connection to Robinhood spans about 18 years now. And 18 years ago, we founded Excellence Boys Charter School of Bedford-Stuyvesant, an all-boys K-8 public charter school, funded and supported by Paul Tudor Jones, by Robinhood, which is a part of Uncommon Schools, a large network of charter schools serving 21,000 students across the Northeast. In addition, helped and was lucky enough to be a part of the Zern team. Zern is an award-winning K-5 digital math program founded in 2012, currently serving 6.5 million kids across the country. Again, Robinhood has been a huge supporter of that. And I think both of us just, again, share that Robinhood's vision around how to best serve and use resources to provide the best experience, the best outcomes for students is something that has inspired both of us to want to work with Robinhood. But I asked a question about your journey as a preface to show that you are literally the doctor who wrote the book about parenting philosophy. So let's start, if we can, just in the current moment before we dive into the book. But as a child psychologist, right now, what are your greatest concerns for children?
I'm actually very worried about a certain percentage, about 20% of kids who are okay right now at home because they don't have to separate from their parents. They don't have to socially interact with the demands of high school or middle school. If they have anxiety symptoms, they're very comfortable, participating in them because no one's watching. And the re-entry back into school is going to be very challenging for them because anxiety is one of those things that you can only fight with exposure and response prevention. You have to get your child out of the comfort zone and into that growth zone to separate every Monday and go off to school and tolerate that icky feeling for a while until they get comfortable back in school. Or they have to tolerate the discomfort of being in a cafeteria for a moment before they find the right seat and find a friend to talk to. And I think that we're going to find a large percentage of kids who are just not going to be overjoyed about going back to school, even though most of us can't wait to get back into the old normal or a new normal. It's going to be very challenging. And I worry that since there's so much learning loss and there's so many other demands on teachers, that we're not preparing our educators and our parents for the kind of tools they'll need to help those kids, almost to scaffold those kids back into the real world. Now, I think there simultaneously will be a small but significant percentage of kids will be more resilient than we've ever seen before. Because unfortunately, after these kinds of horrific events like the Great Depression, World War II, World War I, we do find that people who endure and survive can actually be more resilient. And, we're going to talk about the scaffold effect, but the idea that you could teach your children that failure is an option because once they fail, you're going to help them brainstorm, reorganize, get up and run the race again, or run the next race or take the next test, that's okay. That same kind of resilience we're going to see from a very small group of kids. And while I think that's wonderful, I think we have to be very concerned about the children who are going to have trouble in reentry. I also will tell you that while most kids, and I would tell most parents this, that you should really reassess your expectations for what academic growth and academic productivity should occur during this academic year and certainly for the last semester of last year. For certain kids who we know well, who are in schools with too many students and not enough teachers and not enough resources, many of those kids I worry about will let go. They'll say, I had enough. When you see some middle-class kid or upper-class kid put his head down in front of a computer, I'm not really that worried. I'm not concerned because I know there'll be academic boot camp and there'll be extracurricular, academics when the school year starts, or maybe there'll be summer school. I worry about the public school kid who was just holding on. And for that kid who lets go in 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, unless we have a Herculean effort to bring them back, I worry about what their futures look like, because without that high school diploma, without that athletic activity that kept them involved, or some dance class or poetry class, some teacher who was tapping them on the shoulder, I worry that we have lost those kids to an academic life.
And so much of us are consumed with the challenges of the present. I appreciate you pointing out that we need to be thoughtful about reentry. So let's talk about your book, which I actually binged, like many people are binging Bridgerton. The book is
Wait a second. That is by far the nicest thing anyone has said about my book, that they binged it like Bridgerton. And I've had some good reviews, but I am definitely keeping that one. So
love it.
Binge like Bridgerton.
And it's called The Scaffold Effect. And in it, you introduce new parenting philosophies. I'm assuming on this call today, there are many parents who, like myself, are just desperate for insight, for ways of rethinking parenting, for ways of rethinking how we move forward. So just give us a sense of what inspired this work and the new book. And you actually wrote it, I think, before the pandemic. So yes. I think the insights are acutely useful for the pandemic, but I think the general wisdom is also incredibly applicable to just parenting in general. So where'd the idea come from? And just give us a sense of the work.
So for the past 10 years, the clinicians at the Child Mind Institute have recognized that there's a certain theme that we keep hearing from parents, that they worry about their children's future. Will their kids be independent? Are they doing too much, or are they doing too little for their kids? And this, by the way, is cross-sectional. Poor families, rich families, families of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds have a very big concern that they come to us with a child with a mental health or learning disorder. Will that mental health or learning disorder make it difficult for them to have independent lives? But I think that theme is very, very true for every parent. Every parent wants their child to be resilient, to be able to follow a path, to build a house that they can live in. And so the concept is that really great parenting isn't about rescuing your kid and doing everything for your kid. And I think so many of us can fall into almost like concierge parenting. Can I get you a better class? Can I get you a better tutor? Can I get all of that? Sends a message that you're not capable. You are not competent. I have to do this for you. Instead of a scaffold which stands around the building that is the child that's growing up and works with wherever that building is going. And so what you have to do first and foremost is you have to secure yourself. You have to be a secure scaffold. If you're not providing support and structure and encouragement to yourself, if during COVID, you are not sleeping, you are not eating, you are not doing something spiritual or doing some exercise, you're not a secure scaffold. And even though the book was written before COVID, at one point I say self-care is ultimately childcare. And that if you don't have a secure scaffold and there's a catastrophe, the scaffold falls down and the building falls down. That couldn't be more true today, way after I wrote those words. This is a time where truly self-care is essential. And I think it's so hard in the middle of this pandemic to watch what we eat, make sure we sleep carefully, that we don't binge too much on Netflix, that we have some social distance from our refrigerator. I mean, I went to my internist for my annual physical, and he said to me, Harold, you know, there are 3 outcomes of COVID. You could turn out to be a hunk, a chunk, or a drunk. And if you keep this up, you're going to be a drunken chunk. So, you know, it takes effort to say, I'm going to exercise every day. I don't have to drink at dinner every night. I'm going to force myself to sleep, especially if I have children who need me, who need structure from me now, who are going to need more support than ever, and also need encouragement during this. This is a marathon. So that's how this came about. And frankly, it really works in the respect, if you think about how all of us make mistakes, and the scaffold effect talks about there are redos. You can draw a new blueprint. Even though you might have been doing too much helicoptering or concierge, you can still redo the blueprint for your kid and for the way you parent.
Got it. And so it sounds like integral to this is allowing for some degree of failure.
Yes.
Now, speaking from personal experience, the families and parents that I work with, it seems as if it's in our DNA to want to protect our children. And if not in our DNA, it's a deep part of the messaging we get from society. So if it's so hard for us as parents to allow for failure, any practical guidance on how we can overcome and what kind of metrics or decisions we make around when the right type of failure is permissible?
Correct. So let's just talk about what a scaffold is. So it has pillars, and the pillars are structure, support, and encouragement. And those are constant. You are constantly going to support your kid. You are constantly going to provide structure, particularly during a pandemic, right? We're all going to get up in the morning at the same time. We're going to have breakfast. We're taking our pajamas off and we're putting clothes on. No matter if we're going out of the house or not, we're going to make sure we eat dinner together. Well, pizza night could be Wednesday, movie night on Friday. We are going to create some structure and a semblance of normality in our house. And we are constantly going to encourage our kids. We're not going to blow smoke. We are going to try to get them to leave this comfort zone and try to go into kind of like a growth zone of a place where they can take risk, learn new things. But if they fail, it's okay because we're there to help them readjust, understand the failure, and move forward. But the other things we need is we have planks. We're going to be patient, even if we have to repeat the instructions again and again, but with patience. We are going to be warm. There's going to be a lot of hugging and when appropriate kissing, and really understanding and empathy. You're not going to tease your child. It's really a bad habit. Your children can tease you. You shouldn't tease your kid. No matter what age they are, it can get very toxic. We also want you to, besides being warm, we want you to have awareness. We want you to remember that the scaffold has to be on the same level as the building, which means that you may have to watch cartoons if you have a young kid. If you don't like sports, you're going to have to still pay attention to the football team that your child likes, or the rap group, or the music group. I always remember when I was a kid and I played the Beatles for my father, and I was watching his face and he was trying so hard to appreciate the Beatles because it was important to me. In the same way that decades later, my oldest son was a DJ and he was literally scratching records. And I kept thinking, this is worse than listening to the Beatles from my father, but I'm just going to try to really be aware of where he's coming from. And the other two things are you need to have dispassion, and you also have to monitor progress of yourself and your kid. And the dispassion is very hard for us. I think I told you that when my kids had fights with other kids, I was ready to take a contract out to eliminate that child. Like, how dare that child hurt my child? And frankly, good thing I just kept those feelings inside, because 2 weeks later, the boy who hurt my son was now his best friend. And so being dispassionate means that you are able to have empathy, you're able to be supportive, you're not a false cheerleader who's telling your kid they're great when they're really just average. And at the same time, you're not going to get into a catastrophe if your kid fails. So that, if your kid really has worked hard and has studied hard and has gotten a C or C plus, then that effort is what needs to be celebrated, not the kid who just doesn't study and gets an A. That's something, that doesn't build resilience. That's not going to bode well for the future. So we have to be very careful about what we're reinforcing for which child, because all our kids are usually very different, even if they look alike.
Yeah, and picking up on that thread, one powerful takeaway from the book for me was recognizing my own confirmation bias towards my son,
Right.
particularly related to negative things I see him doing. And a lot of wisdom in the book are things that I think parents assume are being done out of good intention and goodwill. And so I'm constantly pointing out things that I think my son is doing incorrectly. I'm harping on those things. And in the book, you talk about why we as parents are inclined to do it, and you offer a different approach we might take. So can you talk about how this?
I really appreciate it, because I think we all are terrific at negative tracking. What are they doing wrong? In fact, what's wrong with this picture is something that we're great at picking out the details that are incorrect. So negative tracking has a problem because you all of a sudden decide this child is good and this child's lazy, or this child's a bad boy and this child's a good boy. And we negatively track. So we're looking for every time he doesn't put the napkin on his lap, or every time he's talking while he has food in his mouth. A whole bunch of insignificant nonsense that just confirms what we believe. That's what confirmation bias is. That's why a whole bunch of us watch MSNBC and a lot of people watch Fox, and you just keep hearing the same thing. You want to be told you are correct. The problem with negative tracking is that it's bad for the good kid, because the good kid is eventually going to fail and disappoint his parent. And it is terrible for the quote unquote bad kid, who is really going to have terrible self-esteem. If constantly you're being criticized, that is not going to be helpful. So if you could step back and decide that you're going to track all behavior, and you're going to catch your child being good, catch them being good, and catch them being good 3 times and label it each and every time. Thank you so much for telling me that story. That was so much fun. I really appreciate you shared that with me. Thank you for setting the table. You did such a good job. Thank you for cleaning up. It doesn't make a difference you asked them 4 times. Thank you for cleaning up. You did a really good job. For every time you want to see something negative, for every time you want to make something corrective, please sit up straight, please put your napkin on your lap. You have to think carefully, did I catch him being good 3 times? And what will happen, it takes 2 weeks for this change in blueprint. First, your kid is going to think the body snatcher took dad or took my mom. Where's that critical person? But after that, your kid is going to give you more and more good behavior because they like the praise. In fact, we all like praise. We all like to be told we're doing well. And that means that not only do you catch your kid being good, you start to ignore insignificant off-task behavior, stuff that really doesn't matter. And if you pay too much attention to it, you're inadvertently going to increase its importance instead of increasing the importance of that great story or the compliance with the task well done, compliance with the task asked and also a task well done. So try it. It also, by the way, is good for your marriage. You try it with your spouse, and it's great for employees also. If you try to catch them being good instead of nitpicking about everything that they're not doing correctly.
Love it. So all of our listeners who are joining, Harold has given us an assignment. When this call ends at 6:30, if you got kids, 3 positives before you track the negative. If you've got a partner, 3 positives. If you're the boss with your employees, that's your task before.
And do it for 2 weeks and put down a little note before you start about how you feel about the child's behavior, and then figure out what's going on 2 weeks later. You're going to say, what happened? No medication, no therapy. Somehow my kid is just giving me so much more positive things, positive interactions.
And any kids that are watching, you got to give your parents 3 positives before 1 negative track as well. So let's shift, because you did bring up earlier learning loss, and it is a real thing, and it's impacting different groups across New York City and the country differently. And so thoughts about how we keep kids engaged during the pandemic. What practices come into play within education, and what have you with the Child Mind Institute found related to learning loss and best practices for overcoming it?
So this is real. In the same way that I said that parents have to step back and be realistic about the academic productivity. And we also have to be realistic about who is taking the biggest loss based on the pandemic. So if we were going to pick a group of people who've been hit hardest, not necessarily academically, but in general, I would tell you it's 13 to 24-year-olds. So kids in late middle school, high school, and college. If you have been working super hard on your basketball game, on your tennis game, on your track, that your athletics was really part of your identity and was part of what you planned on getting into college, and you lost that varsity year, or you lost the ability to make the team, that is a loss we're not going to be able to give you back. Most kids can't redo another year of high school. They can't afford it, and the school isn't going to permit it. So that's a real loss. For kids who were really dedicated to, as I said, poetry or to dance, those are real losses, because you can't make it back. And also the socialization, the first girlfriend, the first boyfriend, the first makeout session, the first hookup, All of those things have disappeared. And
But,
we
but
have to, yeah.
before you go on, just sorry to interrupt. As a parent, like it crushes me to hear that. So just any quick guidance for how parents counsel and guide their children around the reality that they have lost those things?
So I think the first thing you have to do is you have to validate it for them, because, this is a terrible sidebar, but my parents were Holocaust survivors, and it took for years, and very resilient people. My mother survived with fake papers for 2.25 years, going to 16 different little villages. She had been in law school before the war, and then she was a maid during the war. She was a bad maid, but she was moving around. My father was literally in 14 concentration camps, and they had this positive attitude, but they clearly were scarred by the Holocaust. So when I would come home from school in middle, junior high or high school, and said I had a terrible day, my mother literally would say, well, it couldn't be that bad. The Holocaust is over. Your father is home. There's food on the table. It took me forever to finally say to my mother, Mom, I'm so happy the Holocaust is over, but don't minimize how shitty I feel. I really had a terrible day. And I think there's a lot of value in parents saying, when your kid starts complaining about how bad high school is, or how demoralized they are that they lost out on not being on the basketball team or the wrestling team. I don't really care what it is, but it was whatever their passion was. And teenagers finally get passion and they start to want something. You have to say to them, I agree with you. This is absolutely awful. It is worse for you than it is for me. And, maybe we could go out to the park every day and you could keep running so that your track skills and that your speed will stay, up there, but it's no comparison. There's no scouts looking. I understand that we have a problem here, but let's see if we can keep you fit at least, so that if the season starts again, you're able to rejoin. Or I know how much you love soccer. Let's find one of your teammates to just kick the ball back and forth. It's no comparison to what it was. And think about it. I'm in my 60s. When I think back on COVID 10 years from now, I'm going to say that was a terrible time. It was really awful. It's hard to imagine we were all wearing masks. It seemed like a dystopian novel that I would never, if it was a script, I would reject it. I wouldn't let it become a movie. But we made it through. It's a tiny blip. It really, it affected my life, but not in a seminal way, the way it's affecting teenagers and certainly people in college or people just graduating college. It really is, it's going to have it's going to track them for quite a while. And I think as parents, all we can do is validate it. We can empathize. We can try our best to give them some structure and some ways to deal with it, to be resilient. But at the end of the day, we have to call it what it is. It sucks. Yeah. It's worse for them than it is for us. And as long as we're talking about this, kids under 5, the ones who've been spending so much time with their parents, trust me, none of them are saying I miss daycare. There's no one saying they love being with mommy and daddy. I mean, I worry about how we're going to get them back to daycare or preschool or nursery school. Nothing could be better than hanging out with mom and dad and spending so much time with them. And kids between the ages of 5 and 12, if they have been locked out of school, or if they're in public school where they're getting asynchronized learning, where they're watching a video of a teacher, and they don't have that teacher to encourage them, or an assistant principal or principal, some good human being, adult who's been around, they may really have the biggest learning loss. And that could go for the learning loss for middle school and high school also, but it's not as significant, I think, psychologically as it is for the high school and the middle school. And I really think that, when President Biden said in one of his first speeches that we should have summer school, I think we should have summer school. I thought, that was a throwaway, he said, but that actually is a brilliant idea. That's the kind of thing we should be spending some of the relief money on, because we should pay teachers, we should pay schools to open up and to give kids a really engaging summer school program where they can catch up. The important part for us to remember is that if you're under 24 years of age, your brain works so much better than when you're my age or even my young colleague here. The example I always give is that if you took a 15 or a 14-year-old kid and you dropped them into an isolated part of China where people only spoke Chinese, and you came back 3 months later, that kid would be speaking Chinese. You drop me in that isolated part of China where no one speaks anything but Chinese, you'll come back and I'll still be doing sign language and eating a lot of rice because I won't be able to say fish or chicken. So my brain is just not as good as a teenage brain. And adolescence really ends at the end of 24. When Hertz lets you rent a car at 25, that's when adolescence is over, when your prefrontal cortex is actually communicating to the rest of your brain. So I am telling you to be reassured that we can have catch-up academic growth. We can make up this learning loss, but it's not just going to happen by osmosis. We have to think about it. We have to figure out what are we going to do to make this happen. So if we're going to get kids back to school in April or May, that'll be fine. But we need 2 months. We need July and August. We need all of June. And we need a curriculum that is engaging and gives these kids the opportunity to have some hope that they can catch up on geometry, catch up on algebra, catch up on history. There's a ton of reading that has to be done. And we're going to need to get teachers to come back to school. And that means unions, but we can do it. I mean, I'm always amazed at what America has been able to do. I think about the fact that when I went to Sunday school as a little kid, they threw me in the back of a station wagon with 6 other kids. No seatbelts. We were bouncing around. I don't get into a taxi without putting on a seatbelt now. I was around for the AIDS epidemic in the 70s and 80s, and we thought we were, it was all over. We have drugs that can permit people who have HIV to live normal sexual lives and to be, have full, long lives. So I'm quite convinced the way we got this vaccine that this is doable, but it means we have to think about it and we're gonna have to spend some money on it because learning loss is gonna be significant. If we don't tackle it, as I said, you're gonna lose certain kids who won't come back, and you're gonna have other kids that are now going to be a semester or 2 semesters behind when they have to compete to get into college or to get into some kind of training program later on.
Yeah, and one word that you use, well, two words that you use, engagement and hope. We just so I have just a thought and then a question related to this process, and the observation is related to hope. Many of our students, for many of them, the pandemic has been defined by deficits, right? Loss of lives, loss of jobs, loss of opportunities, loss of freedom, loss of learning, loss of experience, loss of childhood. And I think all of that is true, but I don't think we can only, and nor should we, frame the past year through deficit and loss alone. And we need to recognize and appreciate the ways in which all of our children have grown, and all of them have in some shape or form. And we need to help them, I think, view the past year from an asset-based perspective, right? Because they need to feel good about something and feel proud of something to engage in this urgent effort to close the learning loss gap. And whether it's that they've become more independent, whether they've stepped up at home and they're taking on more household responsibilities, they've learned how to manage their time better, they've become more self-motivated. Like, as we enter into this phase of, again, we need to catch up, there needs to be some intrinsic motivation. I think part of the way we can help them with that is, as parents, as educators, just celebrating the ways in which the pandemic has allowed them to grow and evolve as people.
So I think, that speaks very well to the concept of gratitude, that even in the middle of a pandemic, even with over half a million American lives lost and tens of millions of people getting sick, it's really important that parents spend at least one moment every week talking about how grateful they are, grateful for their health, grateful for their family, grateful for a great meal, for a fun experience, whatever it is. And that kind of gratitude is what keeps you hopeful, right? So that you're 100% right that we've made it through. It was a long marathon. We're not through the tunnel yet. But when we get to June, or the message we should give to our kids is not only did we do this, we thrived while we were doing it. We're going to have a campaign in May this year. Instead of doing, hashtag my younger self, which is always about famous people who have succeeded in spite of having a mental health or a learning disorder, we're going to do a campaign, hashtag getting better together. And that's really important. We will get better. The message should be that it didn't defeat us. COVID didn't defeat us. This horrific event didn't defeat us. We can get better. And I think that that's the way I keep telling parents about chunks. The whole idea of being the scaffold is you're the one who says, let's get through this week. It was a great, and then celebrate the end of the week. If you tell a teenager that they're still not going to be able to go back to school or they can't take the mask off until June, for me, that I think, oh God, I see the light at the end of the tunnel. I'm so happy I can suck it up. But if you're a teenager or you're a 10-year-old, June is 100 years away. So the whole idea of saying we can do this, we'll do it in 1 week, we'll celebrate, and then next week we'll get through the next week, 1 week at a time. And I think that's what we're going to have to help not only teachers who need to provide this education for our kids this summer and when they come back this spring, but we also need to give tools to teachers about resilience, about mental health, about classroom management, because it's going to be more challenging. And we tend to always forget that. We do eye exams, we do hearing exams. We never check in to see how our kids are doing mentally. And I am telling you that we have to be aware that some of these kids will be less than resilient. They're going to need help to become resilient again.
Love it. We're going to go to the Q&A. First question we're getting in, Harold, is, so the scaffold sits around the child. What happens when the child moves? And I think here they mean physically. Does this mean that the whole scaffold moves with the child as well?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example that I definitely thought that my scaffold around my kids could determine what the building would look like. So since I told you I loved being a doctor, I wanted my oldest son to be a doctor. I thought this is a great thing to do, and he's great at science, and I will scaffold to build a doctor, right? A skyscraper that's a doctor. And at some time in 11th grade, my son basically said, by the way, I love science, I hate blood, I am not going to become a doctor. And if I become a psychiatrist, I'll always be the wrong Dr. Koplewicz because I don't even like kids. And I've decided I'm going to become a DJ. So I thought, a DJ, who knew that's a profession? And he was one of 3 white Jewish DJs. He was one of the gophers for Mark Ronson, who went on to get an Academy Award and become a very famous record producer. And the other gopher was DJ Cassidy, who actually performed at the inauguration concert. So it wouldn't have turned out. So we started scaffolding for a DJ. He ended up going to Brown. And lo and behold, between his junior and senior year at Brown, he spends the summer at a bank, and he comes out of the experience and says, oh, I'm going to take a job at the bank. I thought, really, what happened to DJ? The scaffold keeps changing. You follow the lead of your child, because at the end of the day, the child's building might not be the mid-century you wanted. It might be this quirky Victorian or this odd ranch. They have to live in the house, you don't. And so parenting is all about that you keep moving the scaffold so the building is secure, even though you might not be happy with the way the style and design of the house is. That's really not for us to decide. And that's the hard part, by the way. I can assure you, it took a lot of dispassion for me not to say, are you kidding, when he said he wanted to be a DJ. I thought, isn't that a hobby? That's not a job. So,
Yeah. Again, one of the other powerful points of the book that I took away was your encouragement to remind ourselves our children are not us, and a license to let that go and allow them to grow into whatever they are deemed to grow into.
And Jabali, it happens so often. Your old history comes back. I tell a story. By the way, I really made an effort to talk about my mistakes in the book, not only about patience, but about my own kids, because I found that a lot of parenting books, I always feel like they're shaking their finger at me of how I screwed up. And I tell the story about how I desperately wanted my kids to really enjoy sleepaway camp. My wife loved it, the independence, the athletics, and I didn't have a good time. And I was homesick, but I always blamed it on the fact that I wasn't as good an athlete as my father was, or the other kids. So my kids went, great tennis players, great baseball players, terrific swimmers. So my oldest son is 8. He goes off to sleepaway camp. And when we get there, he runs over to us on visiting day and he hugs us just too tightly. You could really, I said, what's the matter? He said, I really want to go home. So we walk into the woods and I said, tell me, what's the problem here? How can we fix it? And he said to me, there's no one here to love me. And as soon as he said that, like a wave of, oh no, here we go again with all that homesickness. I almost felt like yelling at him and saying, what are you talking about? You know how to throw a baseball. You're a great tennis player. How come this isn't working out? And I obviously looked very upset. And the kid says to me, Dad, don't cry. And I thought to myself, he's 100% right. This is not about me. It's about him. And while it's nothing wrong with showing your emotions to your kid, you do not want your child to take care of you. You want to take care of your child. And it took me a moment there to recognize I'm letting my old stuff get in the way. How are we going to make this work so that he can have a good summer at camp and tolerate the homesickness feelings and recognize, by the way, that if he can't, then, he didn't go back to camp the next year. We said, let's figure out something else that might be fun to do. It was clearly my interference of my wanting him to go instead of what he wanted to do. And I think that's very hard for us to always watch, that we're, as much as we want to make our kids' lives better than ours, we have to be very careful not to put our stuff on their back.
Very helpful reminder. We got two powerful questions that I want to share. And for the authors of these questions, we're grateful to include your voice in this conversation. Harold, first question, which I think many parents are feeling: how can I scaffold my kids from my own pandemic stressors? Parenthetical, my child is excited to return and I don't want my own stress to impact their experience.
So we should know, I think it's obvious, but people should be reminded, anxiety is incredibly contagious. Your kids will pick up when, you are nervous and when you are worried. And sometimes it's best to say, you know what, I have a lot of worries about this, but I'm managing it. I'm doing some mindfulness, I'm exercising more, and I can understand how excited you are to go back to school. And what we need to do outside the view of our child is to make sure that we feel confident that they're safe, that whatever we're worried about, we check to make sure that reasonable safety is there. And then we have to live with a little bit of uncertainty for the sake of our kids' mental health. Because at the end of the day, I think you have to have confidence that the school that your child is going to is providing security and safety, and therefore you just have to let them go. Remember what I keep talking about. You want your kid to be able to leave the comfort zone, to go into an area where to take risk, because great parenting isn't about rescuing your kid. It's about giving your kids tools to deal with difficulty and hopefully help them pick the right tool when the difficulty hits. And so this is one of those times where you just have to take care of your own anxiety, reach out and get some help if necessary, so that you don't contaminate your child's return, which is going to be challenging, but we hope they're all going to be excited about running back to school.
Love it. And this next question is a wonderful articulation and a reminder that although we're isolated, the path forward is not in isolation. And the future plans that we have involve multiple constituencies with different needs and well-being that form this very complex matrix. So the question is, teachers, our parents, grandparents, we're all suffering too. And how do we address their needs as people before they are able to address what their students' needs are?
All right. I think let's stick with teachers for a second. Talk about a group of people who, they're being pushed in all different directions. There's a whole bunch of, schools saying open right away. The teachers are afraid that their families will get sick. The same thing happened with first responders. If there was ever a time for us to think about, a wellness kit for teachers, a check-in to say to teachers, why don't you answer 5 questions to see how you're doing, and what a school system, a big school system like New York City, what they can do for teachers. Because if our teachers are the scaffold for our kids during the day, a big chunk of the day, we want them to be able to secure themselves. We want them to feel confident that they have structure, they have support, they have encouragement. And I think very often we forget that. I think they're the unsung heroes on a good day in America. And during this kind of pandemic, I think we really have to have a lot more attention spent to them, because if we don't, our kids will suffer. Full transparency, my wife's a teacher, and I have been listening in the background when she's been teaching on a screen to middle school students. And it is a challenge. Where all of a sudden in the middle of the class, she said, oh, stretch, everyone has to stretch. Or could you please turn on your camera? Could you take a photograph of your assignment and send it in? She is chasing kids more than she ever had to. And she's not able, she has these breakout, she's a private school, so she can have breakout rooms, she can have labs with them. but it is more, it's exhausting to see how many more hours you spend if you're really trying to teach through a screen. So I think we really have to take care of them and give them almost boosters to get them going again when school reopens.
And to build on your concept of self-care as childcare, as we go into this next phase, and hopefully this will be an awakening for how we value teachers, teacher care, educator care is also child care. And it's more evident than ever that that needs to be the case. So let's just pause collectively for 5 seconds of silence. And in the spirit of the gratitude that you encouraged us to share, let's just send teachers and educators in 5 seconds of silence our deepest gratitude for the work that they have done for our children for the past year and historically throughout time. Brilliant. Thank you for that. Harold, you're a hot commodity. They got more questions coming in for you. And this person knows about your past. In the past, Harold has talked about the idea of making memories, those things we keep into adulthood. How do we erase the memories of the last year, or at least just keep the good ones? My own addition to that is, should we be wanting to erase any memories from the past year? But thoughts on that?
I love people who pay attention. You know, you just have to make sure you remember what you said. I happen to talk about that all the time, that if you have a moment to make memories, positive, good memories for your kid, you should take that opportunity. I actually think that while we can share with our kids how awful this year and a half or 2 years, depending, you know, certainly it's going to be a year and a half, has been for them when they are in high school or in college, I think we have to help them balance. That's what the scaffold's about. We support them, we give them structure, but we also give them encouragement. So I would tell them not to eliminate these memories. Remember, we talked about earlier about the resilience that we think COVID's going to have for many of our kids, in the same way that the Great Depression had, in the same way that the greatest generation from World War II. And I think it's a matter of perspective, that that's the gratitude, that every week, what do we have to be grateful for? How was this week an important week? How did we do well? And I think that in the same way that we remember people who passed away, I think it's so important that that number isn't what we talk about, the individuals who passed away. I think we also have to help them recognize that, my goodness, you accomplished so much. You were able to still keep track going. You were able to read, 50 books this year. You were able to learn how to bake bread. We got to spend so much time together that we binged Bridgerton together and we had a great time. And we started to find out how many things we have in common. And I think it's a matter of picking and choosing what what events occurred that are actually positive memories, to make positive memories out of something that was really awful. And I think it's possible, because for those of us who've been fortunate enough to have good housing, to have food, to have some type of educational process still go on for our kids, I think those are important things for us to cherish. And I think all the time we got to spend with each other has to be seen as a positive. Remember what I said about the 4 and 5 year olds? Those are really positive. I hope people made really great memories with hanging out with their kids so much, because the kids are going to really remember that.
Love it. So Harold, we got 4 minutes. In that 4 minutes, I want to ask 2 rapid fire questions, and then I want to ask a question about hope to bring us home. So the first question is, and again, this might not be a rapid fire answer, but as parents are observing their children, just given the year that we've gone through, how do they differentiate between general teen angst and anxiety, or something that may elevate to the level of needing some type of additional support?
So I think that's a good question when it's a good day in America also. It doesn't have to be a day of a pandemic. So there's a big difference between demoralization or adolescent angst and depression, or worry and a real anxiety disorder. And it's a matter of degree. It's a matter of how much distress and dysfunction. But I think there are things you can look for. You look for sleep patterns. Is your child or teenager sleeping more than usual or sleeping less? Have they lost their appetite, or are they eating in a very, haphazard way and almost eating their feelings? Do you find that they're more socially isolated, that you can't get them to sit down for dinner, and that they're spending really too much, more than 6 hours or 5 hours a day in a screen. That's their whole life, and they're very grumpy. There's a change in mood so that they've become irritable almost every day and for most of the day. Those are red flags that I would say, a child who doesn't want to eat with you and is covering up their food, I would be worried that you shouldn't wait and see if it's just a phase. If something like that goes on for at least 2 weeks, and we have so many more eyes looking at our kids now because they're with us so much, the only silver lining that I have seen in healthcare during COVID is telemental health. That all of a sudden you can reach out and you can get somebody to see your kid on a screen, and you can figure out whether it's serious or if it's just normal development. And my feeling always is, all you do is you're spending some time and maybe some money to find out that it was just normal. And if that's the worst outcome, that's not a bad outcome. If, on the other hand, you're able to find out that it's significant, the most treatable disorders in all of pediatrics are mental health disorders. 81% of kids with an anxiety disorder get better in 12 weeks if they get cognitive behavioral therapy and a low dose of an SSRI, a Prozac or Zoloft drug. So you need someone who knows how to make the diagnosis, knows how to use the medicine, and truly knows how to do CBT. But 81% get better. That's remarkable. There's no other set of diseases that has that kind of treatment response. And once you get them better, you change the trajectory of their lives, because if they get one depression that goes untreated, they're statistically more at risk for a second or a third. So I would be vigilant. I would not hesitate to reach out and get help. And by the way, there is free help. The free help, by the way, is childmind.org. We went from 600,000 unique visitors to almost 2 million a month now. We have a terrific checklist, a symptom checker. Spend 20 minutes and figure out if it's something significant or it's not significant. And full disclosure, we don't take money from the pharmaceutical industry, from guns, liquor, or tobacco. So it's scientifically sound, there's no agenda, and you can then take that finding and call your pediatrician to let them help you find the right person.
Love it. And this next one, 10-second response. People are hungry for more. They want to know, what is your next book?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I don't love to write. I wrote a book in 1996 called It's Nobody's Fault. And then in 2002, It's More Than Moody, about adolescent depression. And I had a publisher and a literary agent who were hawking me about write the next book. And I really thought scaffolding was important. We are talking to the publisher, by the way, about a workbook for teachers, because we think teachers should use these techniques also. I mean, the idea of letting, everyone wants their kid to be successful, but the idea that if you're a scaffold, you can help your kid thrive even when they fail so that they can succeed afterwards, I think is something that we as Americans should be able to embrace. And it's very hard when we live in little bubbles in New York City or San Francisco or Los Angeles, and we see all these successful people around, and we want our children to be quote unquote successful. But if we pull back and recognize that is the success is the kid who has effort, the kid who has passion, the kid who's willing to keep trying and take risks. And that requires you to be a scaffold parent, not helicoptering in and just fixing it.
Love it. And so listen, Harold, 6:31 now. I want to thank you. Just like your book, I found this conversation incredibly inspiring, hopeful, full of wisdom. I want to thank your entire team at the Institute. I want to thank everybody for joining tonight. I'm going to throw it to you, Harold, for the last word.
Well,
Any parting? Yeah, go.
Two things. One, parenting is one of the few sports we participate in where we have redos. You can't redo a tackle. You can't redo a tennis serve. You can redo a mistake you make in parenting. And there's nothing wrong with rethinking it and saying, I made an error. I need to come up with another consequence, or I was too harsh. That was too strong a response. So remember that. And that means be nice to yourself. If you're not nice to yourself with not only being forgiving and using self-care, this is not the time to be too harsh. And last, of course, you are a phenomenal interviewer. If you need a new job, I'm going to hire you to work at the Child Mind Institute. You're engaging and fun, and I love when you smile. So thank you so much for doing this with me. It really has been a terrific hour.
Awesome. Thank you. And for all the listeners, can't recommend the book enough. There you have it. Stay strong, Robin Hood. Thank you for everything you do. Have a wonderful night. Extend to yourself gratitude and grace. You all give me hope. thank you for being Robin Hood Herald. Once again, thank you so much. Peace and love, everybody. Have a great evening.